Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Happy to see you here again. After a very wonderful evening in the Audi. I hope you've all been on the third floor. I've been, and it was great to see. It was a very magnificent architecture. And the dinner was also nice. So I hope you enjoyed it. We've now come together again for the last two panels, and I think those are the hottest topics at the moment, so I hope that it will spark some discussion amongst you all and amongst the panel. I would like to remind you that you can ask questions. So the panel first starts with 10-minute presentations all, and then we go into the debate. And I think that Jacob has the intent to ask you questions a little earlier than what we did yesterday. And you can still post, of course, your messages and information or feedback on the message wall. So the first panel is about plastic and circularity, from pollution to a value-based proposition for all. And it's moderated by Jacob Dewar, Chief Chemicals and Health Branch of the UN Environment. Jacob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and also from my side, a welcome to the first panel today on the topic of plastics and circularity, from pollution to a value-based proposition for all. Let me start by congratulating and thanking the Helsinki Chemicals Forum for once again organizing an amazing event. The discussions and the panels deliberations yesterday were really interesting, and I hope, of course, that we can trigger the same type of interaction and discussion today. Also, thank you very much to the panel that has made themselves available here this morning, coming all the way to Helsinki. It's great to have you here, and thank you very much in advance for sharing your knowledge and expertise with the participants at the forum. Before getting going, let me start by introducing our panelists. You have them on the screen. The first one next to me is Ingeborg Mork Knudsen. Ingeborg is a senior advisor with the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment with the government of Norway. Ingeborg has been leading the work of the government on the issue of marine plastic litter and microplastics. Next to Ingeborg is Mark Blaney. Mark is with the European Chemicals Agency, leading their work on risk management, and also is responsible for work around restrictions processes, and is also responsible for the Secretariat of the Risk Assessment Committee. Next to Mark is Lorraine Francoeur from Dow Chemicals. She's the Director of Chemicals Management Policy and Circular Economy. She's a member of the Dow's Global Corporate Sustainability Leadership Team and is also leading their work on advancing towards a circular economy. Next to Lorraine is Eva Karlsson. Eva is the CEO of Houdini Sportswear, a famous Swedish brand known for its outdoor clothing, with high focus on corporate responsibility, and Eva has been leading a lot of their work on redesigning the business to become a force for the good. And finally, next to Eva is Justine Maillot, Consumption and Production Manager and campaigner with the Zero Waste Europe, and also policy coordinator of the Rethink Plastic Alliance. So a very exciting and interesting panel representing regulation and government, representing the private sector from a chemicals production side, as well as a product consumer company, and finally a bit more the activist role coming from the civil society. And plastics is indeed a very hot topic. We cannot open any newspaper today without reading about plastic pollution, and all the efforts that are going into it, both from a governance and government perspective, as well as the initiatives taken by civil society and industry. Plastics is all around us. We all benefit from them on a daily basis. They protect our food, they make our cars lighter, they isolate our homes. In many ways, plastics has transformed our society. It has created wealth, safety, and security. And we also know that plastic and plastic components are an integral part of many of the products that we are using on a daily basis, also contributing to towards a more sustainable world. The problem is the more plastic we use, the more plastic waste we also generate. And this is the plastic waste in particular, the marine litter, that pollutes our environment, that pollutes our oceans, has a negative impact on our biodiversity, fisheries, tourism, and our economies. Let me throw out a few numbers that are for sure of interest to all. They always make people a bit shocked around what's happening around plastics. 8.3 billion tons of plastics has been produced since the early 1950s. Out of this, only 9% of the 8.3 trillion tons of plastic have been recycled. 12% have gone into incineration, and the remaining almost 80% has ended up in the environment, in landfills, or on dump sites. 99% of the plastics that we are using on a daily basis is coming from oil, natural gas, or coal, and as we know, all of these are non-renewable resources. If this trend continues, by 2050, 20% of the world's total oil consumption will be taken by the plastics industry. And another little statistics, 1 million plastic bottles are purchased every minute around the world, and on an annual basis we are using around 5 trillion single-use plastic bags. 50% of all the products that are being designed containing plastics, they are only used for once. So the numbers are quite staggering, but the responses are also impressive, both from governments, from civil society, and from private sector. During our presentations today, we will hear about some of the government initiatives that have taken place in recent months. We will hear from industry how they are indeed stepping up efforts to address the issue of plastic pollution into the environment, looking at some of the major initiatives that they have taken, including investments. We will also hear from civil society what they are doing in order to support efforts and promote action. As mentioned by the moderator, the plan this morning is that we will start off with the 5 presentations. That should take us around 50 minutes, and after that I would really like to open up the floor for comments, questions, reflections, and interactions, and I'm sure that the topic will spark a lot of those, and hopefully also some provocative questions from your side. Talking plastics, we talk circularity, we need to talk design, extraction, production, consumption, and waste management. Let's look at how we turn the problem of today into an opportunity for the future. With that, I will turn over to you, Ingeborg, and the first presentation on the work that the government of Norway has done in promoting governance around marine plastic litter and microplastics.
Thank you very much, Jacob, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first express my thanks for inviting me here to the Helsinki Chemicals Forum to talk about some of the efforts done by the Norwegian government in combating marine litter and microplastics. The history of Norway is in many ways a history of a close relationship with the ocean and its resources. Clean and healthy seas are a key priority for the Norwegian government. And in 2014, when the Norwegian government put the issue of marine litter and microplastics on the agenda of the first United Nations Environment Assembly, it was primarily because we were concerned about the issue of visual pollution. This is what it looks like a lot on Norwegian beaches and along our shorelines. And as you can see, this was a bad sight. Since then, we have put in place a number of measures on a national, regional, and on a global level. In 2017, when the United Nations Environment Assembly met for the 3rd time, we had been building up the case for why addressing marine litter is a growing global environmental concern. And following the initiative by Norway, governments came together and agreed to the long-term ambition of eliminating all discharge of plastic litter into the ocean. Now, that's a very bold ambition, and we are doing our best to translate this into action on the ground. Today, 5 years after we put this issue to the first Environment Assembly, I believe we have gained tremendous amount of insights on the sources, the pathways, and the impacts of marine litter. And the topic of this morning's panel shows that from just being addressed as a problem, this is also an issue of great opportunities. As you know, plastic is a fantastic material, but it is the properties that we value with plastic that makes it a problem when it enters into the environment. Jacob just gave us a number of quite striking figures, and it surely underlines the need for why we have to take action. So I was asked to focus my presentation today on 2 issues, and one of them is how we see the transition from having this ambitious policy action into the impacts on the ground, And the second issue being, how do we work with key stakeholders, such as the recycling industry and large providers of single-use plastics? But let's go back to 2014 again. At that time, we asked the Norwegian Environment Agency to prepare a report on the status of knowledge of the issue of marine litter in Norway. The report clearly showed that this is a growing environmental problem, as I said, and that marine litter originated from a number of different activities, and that it travels across the globe. Quite a lot of the marine litter that we find in Norway actually comes from local sources, and that underlines the need for having local measures. But we also receive a lot of marine litter from our neighboring countries, underlining the need for regional measures. And ultimately, this is a global issue that requires stronger cross-sectorial and international cooperation. And for the Norwegian government, having an evidence-based policymaking is key. So based on this report, we asked the agency to identify the largest sources of marine litter in Norway and proposed new policies, regulations to address these. The further north you travel in Norway, the larger the sources coming from fisheries and aquaculture is. A lot of the Norwegian cities are located along the coastline, and we also have a lot of consumer waste on our beaches in Norway. We also do see that there is a lot of marine litter emerging from the construction sector. We are a large country with a lot of mountains, and to make roads, for instance, we need to make tunnels. And a lot of waste actually travels from that sector all the way to the ocean. We also task them to identify the largest sources of microplastics, and that is wear and tear of car tires, our artificial football turfs, but also paint and textiles. And having such an assessment presented by the agency has provided us a good basis for discussion with the different stakeholders. And I must say that there is a tremendous willingness from both the private sector and the civil society in Norway to be part of this global effort to deal with the issue of marine litter. In the Norwegian Pollution Control Act, we have an ambition to further exploit the resources that are in waste. And based on the proposals, the government provided a white paper to Parliament in 2016 entitled Waste as a Resource, Waste Management Policies and Circular Economy. And this white paper also presented our national plastic strategy. But as part of the European Economic Area, it makes sense for us to also work closely with the European Union on a number of issues that affect this topic in Norway. And the Single-Use Plastics Directive is a priority also for Norway. We have a fairly good system of waste management in Norway, and since the 90s, we've had a very effective system in place to ensure a high rate of return on plastic bottles and beverage cans. Some of you might be familiar with this, but through an environmental tax that decreases as the level of collection increases, we have created an incentive for businesses to ensure a higher rate of return. Today, I think we are approaching 90% of collection of all plastic bottles and beverage cans, and that exceeds the requirements in the directive. As regards packaging, we also have a producer responsibility scheme where the producers and importers of packaging must cover the information, prevention, and treatment of their waste. And we are working closely with the organization called Green Dot Norway in bringing together the different actors to see how that producer scheme also can include issues of cleanup. The Minister of Climate and Environment has also initiated a process to enter into an agreement with the private sector actors that are large providers of single-use plastic items and the civil society organization. This is typically actors that organize large sporting events or festivals, and also in the takeaway business. And this process is entirely led by the industry itself. They will propose recommendations for new policies, regulations to the government by 1st of March next year. And we're already quite excited to see what they can bring as the low-hanging fruits, if you want, by the 15th of September this year. So I think that's a good way of dealing with the different stakeholders. And we are also, of course, considering new measures to address the sea-based sources. We are great supporters of extended producer responsibility schemes, and we are now considering those for the fisheries and the aquaculture sector. And we have also developed an app for tracing lost fishing gear that has received a lot of international attention. But as I mentioned, we need to work closely with the European Union, and we are also providing our inputs to a number of the relevant processes that were discussed yesterday, such as the effort undertaken by ECHA to assess the intentionally added microplastics. But it's needless to say that we need to think differently about how plastic products are designed, used, produced, and recycled. And for us, we believe that better design of the plastic products that will boost the recycling rates and provide better quality for a recycled material market. And this will also pave the way for more competitive and environmentally friendly industries in Europe. So we need to strive for well-functioning markets for secondary raw materials. And to succeed, we believe that it's crucial that we have a development of common standards and criteria at the EU level. But if we are to succeed, we also need to address this issue on a global level. And as I mentioned, we have been working extensively through the United Nations Environment Assembly to put in place principles that we believe should be guiding for the global efforts. Last year, the Norwegian government put in place a dedicated development aid program to support those countries in regions most affected by marine litter, and strengthening waste management is a key priority. But the program will also work with private sector actors to foster innovation. And in 2019, the program will amount to some 40 million euros. Based on a proposal from Norway, earlier this month, the 14th Conference of the Parties to the Basel Convention also agreed on some new measures to address the issue of plastic waste. The first is to amend the convention for stronger control of the global plastic trade, but we also decided to establish a global partnership on plastic waste. And by including different stakeholders, such as the manufacturers and producers in this partnership, as well as a number of waste management actors, we believe that this partnership will be instrumental in promoting action throughout the entire value chain. To promote solutions, better design, and improved waste management systems, I believe that this partnership will help us take advantage of some of the opportunities of keeping the plastic products longer in the value chain and in the circular economy. But ultimately, we also believe that there is a need for a global framework to address marine litter, and that better global regulations will help countries in addressing this issue in an integrated and comprehensive manner, so that we can significantly reduce the discharge of marine litter into the environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingeborg, and congratulations to Norway for the incredible work that you in record time has mobilized and generated not only political, but also support and engagement from the private sector and civil society and IGOs. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions afterwards to you, but before that, let's move on to Mark and some of the work that the European Chemicals Agency is doing on plastics. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Jacob, and good morning, everyone. And I'm very happy to be here today to tell you a little bit about what the EU are doing on plastics, and then more specifically, what my agency, ECHA, is doing on microplastics. So as many of you will know, the EU developed and published a strategy on plastics in January last year. And this had a number of different issues in focus. One of them, which is either on the brink of or has just been adopted, is this single-use plastics directive. This is looking at plastics, as the name says, that are disposed of after one use and then are not recycled. So this is a very important measure that's been discussed and agreed by the member states and the EU Parliament. Other issues in the plastic strategy was about increasing recycling rates, looking to reduce emissions from car tyres, for example, and also other emissions such as fishing waste. But there was also a very important measure in there directed at ECHA, and this was to investigate the need for a proposal for intentionally added microplastics, and to look at these intentionally added microplastics in professional and consumer uses. And this is a bit different from the waste that we normally see on the beaches or elsewhere. This is small pieces of plastic which are intentionally added to products. The most common you'll know about is the small beads that you find in some cosmetic products for exfoliating. We were requested to make this or investigate the need for a restriction, we have been spending the last year developing this, and we proposed our restriction in January this year, and at the moment it is going through the scientific committees of ECHA, and the intention is for them to deliver their opinions at the beginning of next year to the Commission, who will then decide on the next steps. But just to give you an idea of the structure of the restriction, we have 4 main elements, all based on a definition that we've made of microplastics. There are many different definitions that are around in industry or other pieces of legislation around the world. But we took elements from this and came up with our own definition based on the explicit definition of polymers in REACH. Our definition is about these polymers being in a solid particle. There are also size definitions and various other elements which make up this, what we deliver, we think is a microplastic. So the restriction has 3 main elements. First of all, a prohibition from placing on the market for certain uses. And these uses come in over a number of years, up to 6 years for some of the uses. We have a number of derogations for uses which are either well contained, such as those used on industrial sites, or where the end use of the microplastic, there is no emissions to the environment. We also have an element of improved instruction for use, so this is labelling, and this is an element which we actually give the development of this to industry. So where we think that there are risk management measures that can be taken, we think that industry can better develop labelling for these products. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. And then lastly, we have an element of mandatory reporting, because for some of these derogations, we want to make sure that actually they are functioning properly. So we are asking various parts of industry to make a report back to ECHA, so that then if the Commission decide later to take further action, we have a good knowledge base to make any further regulation. So these are some of the products which are included in our restrictions. So this could be detergents. There are plastics used in detergents, which is the top left-hand corner. We have plastics used in printing inks, in paints, in makeup. And what was a surprise to me during the development of this restriction was the high use in agriculture for seed coatings and various other products. And then also has been mentioned the small rubber granules that you find on sports fields and that are spread either by the players or in the north, at least during the winter, snow clearing from these fields. These products are then spread around in the environment. I said I would say a little bit more about the labelling. So we have in the restriction a requirement for labelling when some uses have been derogated from the placing on the market part of the restriction. And when we say labelling, this could be actually a bit wider than labelling. It could be information in the safety data sheet. It could be in instructions for use or package leaflets. And these last two are very specific to certain types of products in the medicinal or in the pesticide type arena. They use these specific instructions for use or package leaflets. And the idea behind this information is to avoid releases to the environment at an early stage in perhaps the use of these microplastic containing products, where perhaps at the end these microplastics no longer exist. And a good example of this is paints, film-forming paints. So when you buy the tin, you have a paint with a lot of very small droplets of polymer in them. But then when you paint them on your surface, they form then a continuous film and are no longer microplastics. But of course, what happens to the paint which remains on brushes or rollers or in roller trays? Quite often these are washed under the tap and go straight into the environment. So one way that we want to avoid this is for industry to develop wording for these labels or safety data sheets to give help to consumers or professionals who perhaps use these paints to dispose of them in a different way. So they can wipe their brushes with paper and then dispose of that in as much as possible and dispose of that in the solid waste, and the same for other types of ways of putting on the paint. And as normal with these type of labelling, they have to be in the relevant EU language, visible, legible, and indelible. At the moment, as I said, the proposal that was made by ECHA is in what we call the opinion-making stage. This is where our two scientific committees in ECHA, the Risk Assessment Committee and the Socioeconomic Analysis Committee, are evaluating the proposal from different angles and will make their scientific opinions on the proposal. And these, as I said, will be submitted to the Commission at the beginning of next year. One important element of this opinion making is the public consultation. And this is a 6-month window for all stakeholders to send in their information or opinions on the proposal. We're looking for information that either challenges or supports the information that's in the dossier that ECHA produced. And we're looking for this information to be submitted by the 20th of September. And this now is the main way of influencing the outcome of the proposal. This is no longer in the ECHA Secretariat, the dossier submitters arena. It's now very much in this public arena of opinion making. So we have a web form which you can use to make the comments and send in supportive information. And this supportive information is very important. You have to justify fully the comments that you make. Then I would just like to encourage you all, if you have information, to send it in, and we very much welcome comments and further information to help the committees. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you also for the call for input to the work that is being carried out by ECHA under the EU. So a lot of work is happening at the governance side. Governments like Norway, the EU as a union is taking action. And there's one common thread in addition to legislation is a call to industry. So Lorraine, tell us a bit about what is it that industry is doing in stepping up to the challenge of addressing the issue of plastics waste.
Thank you, Jakob, and it's very interesting watching yourself walk up the stairs as you walk up there. That's never happened before. When I joined industry 30 years ago now, more than 30 years if I'm honest, no one said to me, Lorraine, welcome to the linear industry, or welcome to the linear world. It just wasn't something that we even thought about. What we did think a lot about was product stewardship, which was my first job in Dow, and sustainability. So what we've done over the years is to work very much on the sustainability aspects of, for example, plastics, and bringing in many of the advantages that Jakob mentioned, actually, lightweighting in things like vehicles, so that there's less carbon emitted during their product life cycle. Simple example that I like to use because everyone can relate to it are the plastic water bottles that used to be very rigid. So even the disposable ones were very, very rigid. And now if you pick one up in most places after you've drunk the water and you're going to crush it before you put it in a recycling bin, they crush almost like paper because of the technical improvement in the product that's enabled that much less material to be used. And also things like durability. When I bought my first car, shortly after joining Dow, and I could finally afford one, you know, it was really a rust bucket. And it was quite common in those days, those of you younger in the audience maybe won't realize this, it was quite common in those days to see quite rusty cars everywhere. And now with improvements in things like coatings for durability, you just don't see it, and we take it for granted that things will last longer. But what we haven't done, and that's quite clear, is we haven't closed the loop on plastics. We haven't been able to take what we've now realized to be a world in which there is no away. We talk about things, throwing things away. There is no away. And some of the pictures that you saw from Ingeborg clearly show that, right? Someone threw that stuff away, or they discarded their fishing net away off their boat. There is no away, it all comes back. So what we absolutely have to do is we have to close the loop. And that's why I wanted to spend a few minutes with you this morning talking about a major industry initiative called the Alliance to End Plastics Waste. And this CEO-led effort really has the potential, I believe, to bring together all the actors in the value chain for plastics to keep them out of the environment. So some numbers of myself now, because in order to solve a problem, you have to look at the numbers and look at the data. So I won't go into this in detail because you've heard this in many forums, I'm sure, but the numbers are actually quite staggering as we realized what the amounts of waste that were going into the environment. And I want to say quite clearly that this was an issue that, as I say, different actors have been working on their piece. I think in this linear mindset, there were companies like ourselves looking at the sustainability, lightweighting, durability, producing better materials for the application that was being asked for. But we weren't very connected. So the fact that all the efforts and the different steps in a value chain ended up with waste into the environment was something that really no one was looking at in a coordinated way. And I think this is why what the power of the circular economy really is, because it gets people together who otherwise weren't really talking to each other in a sort of coordinated way, to look at problems from different perspectives and come up with different solutions. So we really believe that plastic should be too valuable to be lost as waste. That's not the case today. But we believe that has to be the future, and once we can make that happen, we will see that the unacceptable, completely unacceptable fact that there is plastic being lost to the environment will actually stop. I have to press this button really hard, apparently. So, I said, linear to circular, what does that actually mean? So in my world, it means combining the expertise of the whole value chain. Talking to people, talking to waste management companies, talking to designers of products, looking at the way materials are made. Can they be made in a better way that actually would make them not only more recyclable, but that recyclate at the end of its life, when we actually get something that's recycled back, can then be used in a valuable application that people want to buy. The key word in circular economy, there's two key words, one's circle, one's economy, right? No point recycling something and it's some crappy product in the supermarket that no one wants to buy, or that it doesn't meet the quality requirements and the technical requirements that you would need for that application. So we want to make this very action-orientated, and we want to, as I said before, increase the value of plastic waste. And the more that we do that, the more other investors and public-private partnerships can be built that will actually take benefit from this. And as you see on the sofas today, I didn't set up the sofa, but the sofa is a great example of exactly what it is that we want, with the public, private, industry, government, whatever, sat together to solve this issue. And I think there will be big solutions, small solutions. There's going to be a whole portfolio of things that need to happen in order to make this work. So as part of the Alliance, what we've done is separate it or describe it, I guess, as 4 pillars. So there's clearly an infrastructure issue. I was recently in Nairobi, and we took a walk about one of the, I don't even know what you would call it. We were having this fantastic meeting with the local community there on waste collection. That's what the topic of the meeting was. And we were working with hundreds of people actually out there as sort of citizens' action. But as part of what we did, we went to visit a suburb, I'd just call it that. And I don't have the pictures, but I took my own pictures with my phone, and people were keeping their homes and their places of work very tidy. And the way they were doing that, and it was often young kids, it was the school holidays, they were being told by mum and dad to take out the trash, put it in a bag, and go and take it to the waste place. But there was no waste place. There was a bank of a river, and that was where they carefully were putting their waste. So the behavior of actually taking something somewhere away from their home or from their little business was there, but there was no infrastructure in place to actually serve the need of the community. So one of the things that the Alliance really is focused on in those areas, particularly where it's needed, is to develop this with partners. And of course, there's a big piece on innovation. Some of this is going to require new technology, particularly in the area of recycling. Many of you will be much more familiar with recycling than I am. There's different types of recycling: mechanical recycling, which in plastics we call chop and wash, which has great applications, but also a lot of issues if you want to use the material afterwards in sensitive applications like food contact, and medical applications would be 2 that come immediately to mind. So we want to invest in feedstock recycling that will enable us to take mixed waste and really recycle at scale, because this is an issue that needs to be dealt with at scale. A lot of education and engagement as well. Very happy to be part of that. And then, of course, there's a cleanup piece, which we are engaged in as well. I must admit, from my own personal perspective, cleanup is important, but stopping the flow is really important. I say it's very unacceptable to me personally and to the people I work with in Dow that waste is getting, as it does, into the environment today. We're talking some big numbers here. I think this number will only grow. This is a start of commitment from the industry to put 1.5 billion of resources, one way or the other, in partnerships into this initiative. What's really important is that a circular economy cannot be achieved alone. It's very clear that we have to think in different ways, we have to connect in different ways, and we have to connect the whole chain from the raw material producers through to, in this case, packaging producers, brand owners, and retailers, and then out to all of us as members of the community as well. So in the vision of a world without waste, I think someone had that as their marketing system once, but truly a vision of a world without waste. Thank you for letting me talk a little bit today about the alliance and the number of companies that we've brought together already to help tackle this issue, and we hope that with your support and others, it will grow and we will end plastic waste. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lorraine, for that. Turn off the tap. Let's prevent that the plastic enters the environment, and solutions are required. And in order to have solutions, we also need investments, $1.5 billion. That's what 30 big companies, both chemical producer but also consumer goods companies, are putting forward. The textile industry is unfortunately known as one of the most polluting industries, but Houdini is changing that and is turning really sustainable. Eva, tell us more about your fantastic work.
Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here, and thanks for inviting me. Houdini Sportswear, it's a Scandinavian or Swedish outdoor brand. We've been in the business since 1993, and I joined in 2001. Let's see now. Here we go. We've been working hard since 2001 to move from linear to circular. Right now, 80% of our styles in the collection are circular. That means that they are made out of recycled fiber and then can be recycled at the end of life. We aim to be at 100% circular products already in 2022, so only a few years from now. And I'd like to tell you just a little about the journey. When we started in 2001, we knew that we just wanted to be part of the solution rather than the problem. And eliminating the concept of waste is, of course, a given in that sense. Well, it did take us 5 years to even get the first circular product on the market. And it also meant that we had to, after 5 years of inspiration and nudging and discussions with our current supply chain, we moved from our US suppliers to a Japanese supplier, a completely new one for me. I think that can happen also today. Disruptive, new players who understand the needs or the aspirations of new customer groups. And that is why I think it's so important that we are creative and understand that there's so much to do. And we can do it instead of having some early development company surprise us and do it instead of us. So there's a lot of untapped potential for sure in this field, and we can identify design flaws in the system, small and big, and we do that every day. So moving to circular, I would like to just explain what circular means to us. We see nature as the blueprint for circular design. In nature, nothing ever becomes waste. And that is what we're aiming at. For us, that means we do technological products, like polyester products, that are circular in the way they're made out of recycled fiber and can be recycled again. We also design products that are in the biological cycle, meaning that they are made from organic fibers and then can be either recycled or actually put in the ground for composting and become nutrients there rather than contamination. And we never mix the two. The idea is to keep them separate so that it's a natural flow or a technological flow. What else should I? Well, one more thing here in terms of nature. It's the systemic approach. We have to understand the system. Houdini is an ecosystem of production, flows of materials, flows of products in terms of consumption, and the entire system has to work together. In this aspect, we have solved a lot by making circular products, but there is one area where we're not part of the solution, but working hard to get there, and that is microplastics. I will tell you a little more about our work the recent years, but of course, microplastics, whether it's happening in the supply chain during production or during the user phase of our products, and it might be a small part of the problem that is caused by Houdini, but still a part of the problem. And that needs to be solved from our perspective, together with partners. Looking at how we work and understanding the complexity of the planetary system, that is key to us. It's not about selecting something that sounds smart, but rather to understand, together with scientists, which is the most important change to do in the right systemic order, and to understand the implications not only on climate, for instance, but also the implications and the impacts we have on biodiversity, land systems, and oceans. The planet is a system, and we need to understand how we affect the system as a whole. We did a report which is on our website. It was published last year. It was, I think, the first planetary assessment of a company made anywhere. And it's given us so much knowledge that we need in order to take the right directions or the right routes ahead. Working since 2001, that means we've been picking all the low-hanging fruits, and we've moved ahead according to schedule or even faster, but now there are tricky alternatives ahead. One example, moving from synthetics that are made from recycled fiber, creating resource out of waste, so to speak. There's an alternative that has been emerging during the last 5 years, I would say, and that is bio-based plastics. Well, we can see that in our industry there's a lot of brands who choose this path. And when we meet our suppliers and we ask them, okay, so what's the source of this bioplastic? So, most of the time they don't even have the answers. They don't know where it's from. They don't know if it's GMO, for instance. They have no understanding or way of portraying how ecosystems have been potentially damaged by monocultures. So there's clearly a lack of interest, curiosity, or knowledge within our industry to actually know what we're choosing and what we're not choosing. So a systemic and science-based approach is key. Last, there's amazing opportunities, for sure. We're looking at moving not only to 100% circular, but creating this circular ecosystem where there's no waste streams anywhere. Everything stays a resource. And we can also say that we're working in strong partnerships with suppliers and academia to find solutions or new technologies that are regenerative rather than contaminating nature or being at the expense of nature, but working in partnership with nature. I'll give you a couple of examples. One, microplastics. We've been talking with our suppliers since 2013 about the issue. And we have two American fantastic partners, Polartec and Primaloft. With Polartec, we started working on engineering to solve the issue. Engineering of the fabrics using filament yarns rather than staple yarns. And creating air, which is necessary to make the insulating garments we want, but having a new technology, new engineering to make it happen, and eliminating the concept of microplastics. Another interesting innovation project that we're in currently is with Primaloft. There we are actually looking at the polymer and the structure of the plastic polymer. It's polyester in this case. And the first initial results with an additive added to the polymer, we can see that the microfibers are actually turning into natural elements only when it ends up in the ocean. So this type of, we're not there yet. I want to say we don't have products on the market. We're very careful with these types of things, but it's promising to me. I'm not a chemical engineer, but imagine if we can create plastics that when they're in the loop and stay in the loop, they can be used again and again and again. But if they go stray, let's say they end up in the ocean, or in landfill, or in the topsoil, they will just turn pretty fast into natural elements that belong in nature. The last example, I will actually show you a little film. It's on the organic side, but on the organic side in the textile industry, there's still a lot of synthetic chemicals used in the dye stuff and the treatments. And we needed to fix that. It was in a project of more than 4 years, and here's the result.
This is a taste of the future, to be able to cook from things we recycle.
I think for Houdini, it's always been about creating something which is pure enough to have a continuous life.
When making this fabric, the process was quite long. It was several years, actually, because we didn't want to compromise between the function and the aesthetics. So we mixed merino wool with other biodegradable fibers.
I have been composting since more than 40 years, but never textiles. It's important that you do not use material which contains toxic substances, because it can destroy the process and it makes the compost material unusable.
So to be able to make something biodegradable, we really question the base layers that we do and to make sure that they're pure enough. And by only putting naturals in there, which belongs in nature to start off with, we can also bring it back to nature.
The soil from the compost, you can use it as a perfect fertilizer, perfect soil improvement, and it makes your growing much more healthy than otherwise.
Houdini's clothes feels very down to earth and honest, so the challenge was to capture that in every dish. What we could do was, for example, make a broth from the mushrooms. We could dry mushrooms, we could smoke mushrooms. So we tried to put all of that together into one dish.
Det blir ju väldigt konkret när man ser gamla kläder bli fina måltider på en tallrik.
Coming from a completely different story and coming back here in our plates, that is really something amazing.
In our bigger vision, we somehow want to create this positive company that just contributes to the world rather than taking it from it.
You know, it's amazing what we can achieve together, and I think at Houdini we have a sense of urgency, but it's also fantastically rewarding when we make it. Today, youth are striking all over the world, thousands of young people. It's up to us to get our act together and move along fast and without hesitation. Thanks.
Wow, really amazing. Congratulations on the work that you have been leading under Houdini. 100% circular products by 2020, translating clothes into food. I've never seen it before. Congratulations. A lot of the discussions around plastics today and the issue of marine plastic litter and microplastics is in many ways triggered also by civil society. This turned into a movement almost all over the world. A bit like we have seen in the climate, this is also the same that is happening on plastics. So, Justine, tell us a bit about the work from a civil society perspective.
Thank you, Jacob. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be part of the panel. Thank you for the very interesting presentation so far. So I work with Zero Waste Europe. So Zero Waste Europe is a European NGO. We work with communities, with business, local authorities and communities to the same vision, which is basically eliminating waste from our society. When it comes to plastic, Zero Waste Europe works with 9 other leading NGOs in Europe within the Rethink Plastic Alliance in Brussels and within a bigger movement that is called Break Free from Plastic all around the world. So we have more than 1,400 NGOs around the world with this aim of ending plastic pollution. So I just will say a few words. The first one, I mean, I think it was said already very much this morning, is that we really need to look at the value chain. The plastic issue really came from the marine litter issue and from what we could see on beaches or in the ocean. More and more we take, we're very much aware that it's a full life cycle and it's a full chain, and that's something I would really want to emphasize, and the needs to look upstream the chain. So plastic is fossil fuel. Jacob said it, 99% of plastic is fossil fuel. And then obviously it goes into plastic production, into plastic pellets, which will be transformed into products, end up on the shelves of retailers with all the problems of overpackaging that we know through throwaway culture. Then final consumers being at home or on the way consumption. And then comes the problem of how is it collected, is it recycled or not, so how do we manage this? And way too often it ends up in the environment. So this also shows all the economy at the moment, but I would want to say that plastic has impacts all along this chain. It's not just when it ends up in the environment or in the ocean, it has impact on the environment and on health all along the chain. And this is the linear economy, but of course can have a direct impact whether even without even following this chain. So if we take the issue of plastic pellets, for example, which is basically the raw material for every plastic product, plastic pellets is the 3rd biggest sources of microplastic in the environment, and it's all about the industry. It has nothing to do with the final consumer. So we really need to look at the solution upstream, and I think everybody says it, but at the moment the action is still very much being towards the end of the line, looking at waste management, while we really need to look upstream. So I'm just taking the example of the Alliance because Lorraine presented the work that this Alliance is doing, and it's really interesting, and it's good to see companies, realizing the importance of the issue, putting some money in. Where I find some contradiction is that there's 1.5 billion going into this project, which is very good, but at the same time, the companies that are involved in this alliance, they're investing 89 billion, so 80 times more, into expansion of plastic production. So as Jacob said, the plastic production is meant to quadruple by 2050. So if we continue investing into new plastic production, we can improve waste management. This is never going to be enough. So we really need to look at solutions upstream. And in this context, I would like to focus on 2 things. The first one is the role of eco-design. And I think the presentation just before by Eva on sportswear and clothes is a very good example. Here I may focus a little bit more on packaging. So we need to make sure that the products are sustainable by design. So that means reusable, repairable, long-lasting. It's incredible in a way that we use such a long-lasting material that is plastic to do products that we use for a few minutes or a few seconds sometimes. It makes no sense at all. And redesigning plastic means redesigning the products. That also means redesigning some of the delivery systems, and that's just a few examples on the screen of the alternative food delivery system, for example, but also e-commerce with this repack system in Finland, where the packaging can be reused at least 20 times. And then that also means redesigning products so they are free of toxic substances. And we're talking about chemicals here, so I think I wanted to put an emphasis on this. There's a very good database done by the Food Packaging Forum and a few others, including people in this room, that looks at chemicals in plastic packaging. And they identify that at least 900 are very likely to be in plastic packaging, and amongst those 900, 148 are actually considered hazardous chemicals under a different classification. That includes EDCs, for example, and other problematic chemicals. And what I wanted to mention is that among those chemicals, actually 4 at the moment under restriction process within the EU under REACH, and yet those 4 are still allowed in food contact materials, because at the moment there's a lack of consistency between the REACH process and the authorization process on the chemicals that can be in food contact material. The laws will be revised possibly soon, and there's definitely a need to definitely close this gap. And obviously, making sure plastic products are free from hazardous chemicals is key for the protection of the health and environment, but it's also key for circularity, and that's what we're talking about today, because we have to ensure proper circularity, we have to ensure that the recycling streams are clean. And there are a number of reports that now show products, this report with toys, for example, that shows products with recycled content with hazardous chemicals in them. And we know the problems of recyclers to deal with a lot of the plastic waste. They don't know the chemical composition of the waste they're meant to recycle. That creates a lot of problem, and this is definitely limiting the possibility of circularity. So a few words to finish. So really what is important in the circular economy is to focus at the beginning of the circularity, which is prevention and reduction. This is completely in line with the waste hierarchy. And I would like to emphasize that Zero Waste Europe tries to do that at different levels. So we work at the local level with the cities on the waste management aspects, because it's key, and the local authorities have a key elements, but also in looking in alternative business models. So for example, the cups in Freiburg, the city of Freiburg really invested in this system of reusable cups, and they invested in this, and this is an example of how cities and new business model can really go together and create new opportunities. We also work at the regional levels, at the national European level, because it makes obviously a lot of sense, and also at international level. I think Ingeborg explained a lot what is happening at the moment. There's a lot of things and discussion. What happened in Basel with this decision on waste trade is really critical. And as it was outlined, obviously the plastic pollution issue is a global issue, including with Europe exporting a lot of its waste. And then there's different elements, and this is just food for thoughts maybe for later, but we've talked a little bit about regulation, be it at the EU level or the discussion at the international level. We're all aware of the Single-Use Plastics Directive. This is a very good tool. It's a first step, but this is really important. There's the ECA process on microplastic at the moment. There's a lot of discussion how to deal with other sources of microplastic. But I also wanted to say that there's probably a big role to play for economic incentives as well, going from extended producer responsibility schemes with proper eco-modulation of fees, so that there's a real bonus-malus in terms of economic and to incentivize eco-design. But there's also discussion on looking at taxation of plastics, for example, and other things. And clearly, where we put the money will make a big difference, because I think there's an agreement overall that, yes, we need to follow the waste hierarchy. We need to focus on prevention, yet the money at the moment mainly goes towards the end of the line, which is obviously waste management and recycling is really part of the solution, but we also need to invest much upstream in the value chain. It will have a much bigger impact. So I will just finish with a very simple image, and simple is fine sometimes. If we take a bath, clearly at the moment the bath is overflowing. I think this is very good that we all realize that the bath is overflowing. And it seems we're trying to look for flow clause or to find a bucket to maybe remove a bit of the water from the bath. And maybe this needs to be done, but the first thing everyone would do is to just close the tap. And at the moment, what we're doing is we're not closing the tap, but we're actually making more pressure on the tap and continuing plastic production. So we just need to use some common sense here and really start with the reduction at the source. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Justine, for that presentation as well, and for highlighting some of the other solutions and challenges, looking at upstream solutions. How do we avoid that hazardous chemicals becomes a disruptor to circularity? So let's give all of them a hand for the excellent presentations while you're thinking about your questions. And let's look at the solutions, because in many ways we do have the solutions presented here in the two couches and the chair, from a regulatory perspective, from a chemicals industry perspective, from a textiles perspective, and from a perspective of generating new ideas. So I can see that we already have the first question over there. Please go ahead.
Hello, I'm Andrew Cox. As someone who's visited Bangladesh, a country which gets most of its export earnings from producing textiles, many of which end up in Europe, and particularly in the UK, where people go to cheap garment outlets. How did the panel think that, how are you going to help countries like Bangladesh reduce the impacts and the problems from its fashion industry, from the production of fashion? You know, the impacts in terms of pollution, plastic pollution included, plus also sustainability, and also, you know, socially responsible issues as well. So my view, the key challenge for this panel is, how do you help countries like Bangladesh reduce their impacts and improve the society, you know, help them improve their society at the same time?
Excellent, thank you very much. While the panel is thinking about a response, I can see we have another question. If you could also just introduce yourself.
Thank you, good morning. Bob Dietrich from the OECD. I actually had 3 questions, so brace yourself. There was a lot of talk about biodegradability. So I had one question to Mark. In the development of the restriction proposal, I assume there was a lot of discussion about exemptions for biodegradable microplastic. I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit about the outcome of that. Did you come up with a definition of what biodegradable is, and how is it used in the restriction proposal? And in the same way about biodegradability, biodegradable or compostable plastic means that you have to separate it out from non-compostable textiles. And so how would you propose to achieve that? Do you propose to have your own recycling mechanism to ensure that only your textiles that are compostable and non-toxic end up in a composter? Or how do you propose to set up a separate recuperation system? There was also a lot of talk about chemical recycling. This is news all the time now, chemical recycling being a potential game changer in the recycling of plastic. Now, what I understood is the further down to raw material you go into your chemical recycling, the more energy you have to put into it, and the less viable it becomes commercially. And so I was wondering whether there is any studies going on about what are the most viable options in terms of chemical recycling, and also is there any studies going on about what are the environmental impacts of chemical recycling? Thanks, and I'll stop here.
Excellent, thank you so much, Bob, for those questions. So 4 questions back to the panel. Maybe I start with you, Mark, around biodegradable plastic. What does that really mean?
Okay, thanks, Bob, for that question. I think it's important to say that actually we think the issue of biodegradability of polymers is the key to making this restriction and other other EU measures on plastics work. We spent a lot of time in the development of the restriction to think about how industry could meet the requirements that we were putting on them. And the way that we saw some of industry already moving was to develop biodegradable polymers for the uses that we saw that there was a high amount of microplastics. So we developed within the restriction a tiered way of showing that a microplastic is degradable, biodegradable. Various different sorts of tests and systems can be used to show that. And then if this is demonstrated, then actually that plastic actually is, or polymer is no longer a microplastic, so it's totally out of the restriction. So we think that promoting this innovation in biodegradable polymers also helps industry. It kind of, part of REACH is also about stimulating innovation, so this is one way we can do that, and also allows industry to have a way of not being caught by the various parts of the restriction. And also just to mention this, as I said, this is an element which is covered in many different current or proposed legislation, such as the fertilizers legislation. This also is looking to biodegradable polymers to be the solution for EU marketed fertilizers. So we're also aware that other legislation has this requirement, and if the restriction goes through, then of course there will need to be a lot of coordination between the various parts in the EU to make these consistent as well. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mark, for that. And along the same vein, Eva, I think two of the questions, or at least one of them, also direct to you in terms of recycling. You know, how can your clothes be put into the compost? How do you ensure that the clothes that you are producing are not containing any of the toxic chemicals that we are talking about?
In terms of fiber mix, we don't mix fibers that cannot be recycled together or composted together. I know that is very different compared to the general way of working in the industry, but as we have been taking care of or taking responsibility for our own recycling since 2007, it was key for us to create design principles to enable end-of-life recycling at an effective level. So polyester stays pure polyester, even though it's a shell layer with a membrane and all sorts of things. So all in all, our products are more at the level of a PET bottle in terms of pureness. And the same goes for the organic fibers. We only mix, for instance, tencel with wool or other organic fibers. And that, there we have the implications with chemicals, treatments, dye stuff, and so forth. And there we work with BlueSign, which is an input-output stream partner who can help us to understand which chemicals goes into processes and then what comes out at the end, other end. I wanted to also comment on Bangladesh and other countries where the infrastructure is poor. The reason that textile companies are going to Bangladesh is because they don't have to pay. So they're compromising with social aspects, maybe ethical aspects, and for sure environmental aspects at the end of the day. And if we want Bangladesh to have a chance, we have to work with them as partners as we would with a partner here in the EU. Pay decent prices and not push down margins or push up our own margins. And that will enable development there as well.
Thank you very much, Eva. And if I can turn to you as well, Ingeborg, in terms of global policies, how do they support countries in sort of preventing pollution, and not only the textiles industry, but broader industries as well?
Thank you very much, Jacob. And I would like to share an example from discussions we had with the Environment Ministry of the Seychelles. Now, some of you might have had the pleasure of visiting the Seychelles. I have not myself. But they underlined their need of exporting all the waste that they generate away from the islands, but also that they import all the products to the island. They have very little power in influencing the design and the production of plastic products entering their local market. So what we believe is one of the key features of a stronger global governance framework to deal with this issue of marine plastic litter is that it will assist countries in providing stronger regulations that again will also help them make industry take part of their responsibility. And I believe that speaks also to the example that Eva shared from Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And while you're getting ready for the next questions, let me turn one also to you, Lorraine, about chemicals recycling.
Well, and can I just mention before I talk about that on the biodegradability, because I think that's one issue which everyone's so confused about, and they confuse it also with bio-based. And I hear people say to me, well, this is bio-based, so therefore it's going to biodegrade. And I think that's something that actually I can help with, and others across industries, to explain that to a, obviously concerned public. And what Mark was talking about was intentionally added microplastics, right, and having a way forward. And if you look at overall biodegradable plastics, I've seen, as I'm sure many of you have, some quite horrible pictures of a bag that's been taken out of the sea after 3 years and it's still able to carry the shopping. So we do actually think that it does confuse things, confuses the consumer. It makes some of the technical solutions for end of life more complicated, and it's often confused with bio-based. On chemical recycling, yeah, you're hearing a lot about it, and sometimes you hear it called feedstock recycling, because it truly will be a game changer, and I think it will apply to the issue that we have over the last 30 years. We've added 2 billion people to the planet. All of us have access to goods and services that we could only have dreamt about when I was a young person. Things like access to all sorts of consumer goods, it's incredible. And that's not just in the West or the developed countries. It's really, lifestyles have improved around the world. And in order to match that growth, we have to start to bring things back in a loop, and we have to do things at scale, so that while some of the things that you see of folks collecting, and some systems are working quite well in some countries, like PET bottles for the water, for example, but we have to really industrialize. It's not a very fancy word, I know maybe people don't like it, but if we have industry and manufacturing supporting these goods and lifestyle, I think we have to take the same technology and the smart people that we have working there and use their brains to actually say, well, okay, how do we remanufacture this material back into a usable format so it can be used across the board?
Thank you very much. Justine, I don't know if you want to react to any of the questions here. Otherwise, we have another one there, and we have a lot on the screen as well. Just speak.
It is on, very easy. Thank you very much. Just maybe would like to second what Ingeborg said in terms of the role of global policy with regard to Bangladesh. I think Eva said a few words on the textile industry, and I think there's different questions here. There's the textile production, which has many social and environmental issues, which I'm not an expert on. And with regard to plastic pollution, what Ingeborg said also in terms of the role of the industry, because there's indeed production of plastic there, but there's also a lot of ore exports from Europe and from the US ending there, meant to be recycled, and we know they're not, because just the infrastructure is not there. And I think the role of producers in this and the role of, for example, extended producer responsibility is interesting, because there are APR schemes in Europe, but there's none at all in Asia. So maybe a role of the industry could be to set up such systems with governments there, so that they can support just having the waste management infrastructure, the treatment and the collection of waste.
Thank you very much. You want to react? I could see, Lorraine.
I just want to say that actually that's one of the things we're doing in Africa, is having discussions on EPR right now. So thank you for making that point.
Great. I have a question here on microplastics that I will come back to later. Why is that the problem? But first, I'd like to take the question from over here again. Also, if you could introduce yourself.
Yes, absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Marco Valentini from the European Chemicals Agency. First of all, thanks to the forum for addressing this very interesting topic, and to all the panelists for very interesting presentations. My question, or if you like a curiosity, is more to Eva. Thank you very much for sharing your experience, and also for a very nice video. I found it very powerful and moving, I dare to say. Having said that, it's great what you have achieved, and it's great that you're moved by this environmentally friendly consciousness, but ultimately you are a business, so I think you have to ensure profitability. So I'd like to ask, if possible, if you could share a bit more about the costs that you had to face to move from a linear to a circular production, and to what extent these costs have been also contained or passed down to consumers in terms of the price of the product. Because of course I assume that if the same t-shirt or product is now twice as expensive, this could also be causing some constraints or reluctance in buying the product. So if you could clarify a bit more about the cost, I'd really appreciate. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Let me take one more question, and we'll come to you, Eva. Over here.
Hi, good morning. My name is Mike Shade. I'm with Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families, and the Mind the Store campaign. In terms of thinking about the circular economy, I mean, a major concern that we have is the issue of chemicals of concern, such as phthalates and brominated flame retardants showing up in recycled materials when they're not properly managed further upstream. So for example, some studies have found brominated flame retardants in recycled plastics used in food service ware. We've seen orthophthalates in recycled vinyl plastics, which is a significant concern. So curious if any folks on the panel can talk about policy solutions to address chemicals of concern in recycled plastics, to ensure that as we move towards a more circular economy, how do we ensure that we're not reintroducing and recycling toxic chemicals back into commerce, particularly in products where they were never intended to be used in the first place, such as in food service ware, for example?
Excellent. I think that's a question for the whole panel. Let me start off by you, Eva. What happens to the costs? Who is paying the price for turning circular?
Well, we've been doing a lot of innovation, and of course that costs, but there is a clear business case, and that's been it's been that way for quite a while, but now we can see, since maybe a couple of years, that the demand and the in-depth questions from customers is increasing at such rate that I think we should ask ourselves the opposite. Can we be profitable if we don't work on sustainability issues? But then, to be just a little more clear on the details, currently when we buy recycled fabrics without compromising with quality or aesthetics or anything else, compared to choosing a fabric that is made from virgin fiber, for instance, the cost is probably about 30% more, so our margins are lower. That's the case. But that's because it's too cheap with current legislation to do the wrong thing, to use virgin fibers. And we're seeing some indications of legislation in Sweden in terms of chemical use in textiles and footwear. And I guess that is only, I hope even, that is only the start. and that we will see a shift towards legislation and regulation where the good alternative has the decent price and the high impact alternatives are pays their own costs in terms of environmental destruction and so forth.
Excellent, and thank you for making the point. Can we make profit by not turning sustainable? And I think this is a lot about what we are seeing at the panel today, that there is a commitment across the full value chain that we have to turn sustainable in order to change our business models to the future. The business model of today will not serve the world in 20 years. But next was a policy question: circularity, hazardous chemicals. Is hazardous chemicals, or are hazardous chemicals, a disruptor to circularity? How do you address that from a policy perspective? Mark, do you want to start off?
Yes, I can start off. I also see there's a smorgasbord of questions down there which mention ECHA and the restriction proposal, but I'll stick to this one for the moment. I could have talked, of course, on a different topic than microplastics. Work that ECHA is doing is not just on this. We are doing much more on plastics. Some of my colleagues, for example, have been involved in a project looking at additives to plastics and mapping where these are used and whether or not these should be proposed for further action. And this is a report that was published on the ECHA website not so long ago. In my unit, which deals with restrictions, we've also recently been looking at certain additives in plastics, such as phthalates in articles, and also before that on Deca-BDE, which is a brominated flame retardant. And in both cases, we looked at whether or not we should derogate recycling for these restrictions. And in both cases, we actually spoke to recyclers, looked at the evidence in the literature, and actually it was clear that for Deca-BDE at least, that sorting could be used to remove the Deca-BDE containing plastics from the stream, and actually the recycled plastic could meet the same concentration limits that we set as for virgin plastic. So there we very carefully looked at the recycling and whether or not products could be recycled that had Deca-BDE in them. Because these are part of a feedstock, then of course the use of other non-contaminated plastics can help with that issue. So we're not just looking at microplastics, we've looked at a lot of different aspects of plastics and circularity.
Excellent. And Ingeborg, your life is policy making. So from your perspective, what can we do?
Thank you very much, Jacob. And as I mentioned in our presentation, Norway being part of the European Economic Area, it makes sense for us to support the efforts done on a European level. Of course, we are very concerned with this particular question also from the Norwegian government side, and we need to make sure that we are creating safe products for the future. So that's why we are supporting the efforts going on the European level. Thank you.
So while I ask you to line up for the next round of questions, maybe I could take one or two from the message board. There are many, so I can't see all of them now, but there's one around how do we define single-use plastics. That's maybe one to you, Mark. And then I also want to ask you back, Ingeborg, but also the others in terms of why do we want to focus on microplastics? Maybe as a little anecdote, I can say that from the textiles industry, just from washing our clothes and the microplastic fibers in our clothes, that's equivalent to 50 billion plastic bottles are entering the oceans on an annual basis. So how do we define single-use plastics? And from a policy perspective, Ingeborg, why do you want to focus not only on marine plastic litter, but also on microplastics?
Okay, I mean, I can give a very quick and simple answer. In the Single-Use Plastics Directive, there has been a definition given of single-use plastics as it applies. I don't have that on to my hands at the moment, but of course in any legislation there has to be a clear definition of what it applies to and what the scope of the measure is, and in there is a very clear definition of what they mean by single-use plastics.
Just very quickly, the initial group of 10 single-use plastics that were part of the directive, are part of the directive, that was determined also by the fact that those were the items most found on beaches, if I'm not incorrect there. So they were defined as being the priority areas to work on.
Thank you. So I should address the issue of why we also need to focus on marine litter and microplastics. Back in 2015, when we had the first assessment report provided by the Norwegian Environment Agency, they underlined the need for cleaning up plastic litter found along the Norwegian shoreline and on the beaches, as the larger parts of microplastics being subject to the currents, the sand, the mountain, and the sun created a large source of microplastics. So that's the level of understanding we started with in 2014. Then we supported the knowledge generation under the United Nations Environment Assembly in parallel as the Norwegian Environment Agency was preparing for the specific report on the sources of microplastics. And it actually turned out that we didn't know from the Norwegian government side the typical sources of microplastics in Norway, and as Mark presented, a number of us were very surprised to learn that our artificial football turfs was actually the largest source of marine plastic, as well as the wear and tear of car tires. Now, as far as I understand, the issue of microplastics is also different because it could be a vector for transporting harmful substances, and it's also very different to clean up microplastics compared to larger microplastics items in the environment. So over the past 5 years, I believe we've bifurcated a bit from treating the issue of marine litter and microplastics in a similar manner, whereas we realized that maybe the issue of microplastics is more related to the way we managed chemicals in the past. So from our side, we are now starting to look at this as a joint but also somewhat separate problem. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Justine, also a few reactions from you, and then we'll do another round of questions.
Yes, just wanted to add on the single-use plastic. Indeed, there's a definition, maybe just to give a sense of what the definition says. Basically, it says that it's a product that has not been conceived to be going back to a producer for refill or for reuse. So basically, anything that is not meant to be reused. You could argue that your plastic bottles, you may use it several times, but it's not designed in that way. So that's where the definition came from in the single-use directive. And I think the Commission will come with a bit more guidance, because for some items it still poses some questions indeed.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you can see the questions. Some interesting ones are coming up. Some of them are provocative, so let's get to them later. Let's start off with the next question over here, and also if you could introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. My name is Ninja Reinicke from ChemTrust, and thanks to the panel for the good discussion so far. I have a question to Lorraine. In your presentation, you said, let's turn off the tap. So I think I wholeheartedly agree. Could you give us a few more examples how Dow is planning to reduce some of the production of polymers, maybe how you're trying to contribute to turning off the tap? For me, the first obvious examples would be to take the chance of the restriction on microplastics under ECHA. But actually, what I see is the first thing industry does is to do a legal analysis to throw into doubt if that's actually a good tool. So I'm a bit disappointed about this mismatch. Thanks.
Excellent. Let's take one more.
Yes, hello, Maggie Saikali from CEFIC, but the question is really for me personally. I was very struck by Lorraine's presentation, and especially the last slide with the map of the cooperation. And I noticed a very conspicuous gap, which is, to take Justine's metaphor about the bathtub, was akin to having a giant bathtub with 4 small faucets and a very large one, and the large one is still running. And I mean China. What are we doing there to export our all of our initiatives, and how to have a global cooperation, because the problem is global and not just located in Europe?
Very good. 2 interesting questions. Lorraine, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think that would be good. My name was mentioned in both of them. Thank you very much for the questions. I think I said stop the flow. Maybe I said turn off the tap, but I thought I said stop the flow, but okay. We are doing things along the whole cycle of the circular economy. So there's things which we can do. We've always worked on improving the efficiency of our production. We look at the design of products. So one of the issues on circularity is the fact that as our demands for certain products, including packaging, which everyone sees as something that you use, quote unquote, for a few seconds and just rip off, but in fact it's performed many functions, possibly through weeks or even months while that product has been in the whole value chain. So as the demands of the global markets have increased, that packaging has got more and more complex, which actually does some good things sometimes, like lightweights it, but also makes it harder to recycle. So where we have focused as things like, for example, designing packaging, which is now mono-material, which we have as an offering, which can go through the whole circle and be recycled much more easily back into products which can be used for the same purpose, as it were. On the microplastics piece that you mentioned, we don't make microplastics. Now, what we do have, of course, and it's our big raw material that as our product that we sell for others to use as a raw material, are plastic pellets. And so those were around 5 millimeters, I think, in size. I can picture them in my head. I've never actually personally measured them. And it's very important to us that we keep those out of the environment. And in the past, we've had something called Operation Clean Sweep, OCS. And this has been something we thought was good to have. And now we know that it's absolutely essential to have. To keep those products out of the environment. So I applaud the microplastics focus because it's given, first of all, some, I think, transparency into some use of polymers which many of us, including myself, were not even aware was happening. And you have to ask questions sometimes, why is that? And it's also helped us to improve the focus on the whole pellets piece, which is, after all, our product, and we should take full responsibility for it throughout the value chain, and that's what we're doing ever increasingly. And the other question was about, what was the other question? China. Oh, the map, yes. Yeah, I should put a big X marks the spot over China, because you absolutely picked on something that is very, very true, and we're working on that very, very hard. It's an area of great growth, as you all know, and it's also an area where working with the governments and a non-governmental organization is quite different from many parts of the world. So we are active. We have workshops that are planned later in the year to be in China. We have a team in China, a coordination team who's working with partners there. So all I can say is I absolutely agree, and that's a gap that we really are committed to filling. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. I know you, Justine, and also Ingeborg wants to react. Mark, maybe also. So let's start with you, Justine.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to use the opportunity to have a follow-up question on pellets, because indeed pellets are a major source of plastic pollution. It's often not in the debate for many reasons. And you said you're involved in the Operation Clean Sweep, which is this industry-led initiative of good practices. And there's indeed a lot of good practices in terms of technical solutions. And one question I will have for you, because the European Union is looking into what to do with pellets, and they're also looking at the regulatory approach. And we think there's good practices in this Operation Clean Sweep. The problem is the system is not mandatory. There's no third-party verification. Plastic producers are involved, but the plastic transporters, converters, much less. So I would want to ask you if you would support any legislative instrument that would make these best practices mandatory all along the supply chain. Thank you.
Lorraine, you want to react quickly?
So what we're working on is a system of certification, because we agree that this third-party certification is missing. And there are many members of Operation Clean Sweep, right? So I'm not speaking on behalf of Operation Clean Sweep entirely today. I'm really speaking on behalf of what we think within our own company. And we believe that certification is really important going forward. And to the extent that we can control the situation, we're looking very carefully at how we engage our freight forwarders, how we write those contracts, how we would go out into the field and look at what's really happening around the world as the pellets get transported. So,
thank you, Lorraine. Ingeborg?
Thank you. I just wanted to address the comment on how we can help improve action on a global level based on the experiences that we have within the European region. And one thing is sure, that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to this problem, and it's important that we think about the different local contexts and the different nature of the problem where it is. As I mentioned, the sources that we find in the north of Norway are very much linked to our fisheries and aquaculture. It's a very specific problem to our region. But we also do, through our development aid program, work with central actors in Southeast Asia and also a number of African countries. And you will remember that I mentioned our deposit return system. It has stirred a lot of attention on a global level, and we have so far had visits from 23 different countries worldwide to the association Infinitum outside the city of Oslo that runs our deposit scheme. Now, that's a system that has been in place since the 1990s. We have a fairly high technological solution on how it's basically a return vending machine, right? You put the bottle back into the vending machine. But we believe that there are some important lessons to be learned in how we develop that extended producer responsibility scheme that can inspire action elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm very keen on getting a reaction from you, Mark, to the comment here about the legislation on microplastics. But before doing that, because I want to register also that we have another question from the floor, and I'm sure we're going to get one over there as well. So let's start with that. Again, if you could introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much for the very interesting discussion. My name is Willem Vriesendorp. I work with FIPRA. We do public affairs, focusing on sustainability. I think that ultimately, and it's been mentioned before, but that everybody is necessary in getting to a solution. So I really welcome all the contributions from everyone in the panel. We've been focusing a bit on sort of upstream and maybe also on legislation and how you can from the top down try to solve this issue, because it's a real issue. When we just depart from that and look from the bottom up, I was just also interested in the consumer angle, and I tried that yesterday as well. But how can we better enable consumers also to vote with the wallet and to actually help make a business case for more sustainable consumption and more sustainable products? And I think I was just very interested also in what maybe Justine is doing on that side of the paradigm, because if you rethink plastics, you should maybe look both ways. And I'm just very interested, maybe across the piece, but starting off with Justine, how you and Rethink Plastics and others can help with sort of enabling that force in the market. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Maybe turning straight back to the panel. Both what are you doing, Justine, but also Eva, how do you educate your consumers? Who are the consumer or the customers that are coming to buy Houdini clotheswear? Are they buying it because they know what you're doing, or is it because they want the design that you are presenting?
Thank you for the question. Indeed, I mean, awareness raising is one of the key things the civil society in general does. Within the Breakthrough from Plastic movement, we have groups all over the world, very, very local groups. I mean, I work in Brussels. I'm a kind of a policy person, but I'm not representing most of the movement. Like, it's really much more people on the ground doing a lot of activities in terms of what we call cleanups, what we really rather call collection of waste, and also to get information of where the waste comes from. And that's then quite useful to also look at maybe which plastic should be regulated and which are the most problematic ones. So we are doing that. There's clearly also an ask from the citizens to really move away from some of those plastic that we know we cannot recycle, etc. So there's a lot to be done here. I think there's a willingness too, but then it has also a link with what is put on the market, and we're also raising awareness of consumers for them to ask their retailers, and the retailers will go possibly upstream as well to get on the market products that are really sustainable. But I would say there's still a lot to be done in terms of also explaining, because we tend to tell the consumers, yes, of course, you should put these products to the recycling bin because it's recycled, but what most consumers don't know is that actually it may not be recycled or it will be shipped away, so there's still a lot to be done. We mentioned biodegradable and bio-based plastic earlier. I think there's a lot, and we're trying to clarify that as well, because there's recent studies in Germany where it showed that a lot of people consider that bioplastic were plastic that were sourced from organic agriculture, and that would necessarily be biodegradable, which is obviously all of this in this sentence is incorrect, but there has been so much confusion around it, and it's also sometimes it benefits the industry, obviously, because it's a way of putting a green label on a product that is actually not necessarily green, because I don't want to go into the but biodegradable, as was mentioned already, at the moment in Europe, that means industrial composting. That's the only standard, so that means it needs to be collected separately, and it's still an end-of-life disposal of the waste. And then for bio-based, then it raises all the questions of where it is bio-sourced from. So very shortly, yes, we work a lot. I mentioned it less here because it seems awareness raising is happening anyway. We talked a lot about it, but what I think is missing in the debate is really what are the solutions at the production phase, and where maybe the industry has the most role to play, because they're the one designing the product. Thank you. Sorry, it was long.
Eva?
As a brand, I believe we have both the opportunity and responsibility to educate and inspire our customers. And the way we've designed our products, designed for longevity and versatility, we're thinking that a small wardrobe that enables you to do a lot of stuff and most things in life is smarter than having, I know, I've seen a number, the average use of a garment before you discard it is 5 to 7 times worldwide. That's a crazy number. We have garments coming into us for repairs after 10 years, so it's a huge difference in the way you design your product. And there's also another interesting development in the early development among front runners, and that is product as a service solutions. And that's not only in the textile industry, it's just as much in every industry, car sharing and so forth. And that will in itself solve some of the issues, because if companies start owning the products and having responsibility for products throughout the lifetime and also for the end of life, that means companies will want to design the products to last longer and be able to repair them and be able to reuse the resource at the end of life. So there's interesting things going on, and as I said, as companies or brands, we have the opportunity but also responsibility to make sure that we contribute as much we can.
I just want to make a comment, more even as a consumer than maybe as a producer. As a consumer myself, I do have a vision that when I go shopping, every choice I make is a good choice. I already have enough crap to think about, right, at home and work and kids and dogs and everything else. And I know that we're a long way away from that, and I think there's some examples that have come out today of people who are working that space. There's this project called Loop, for example, which has just started in Paris and New York, I think, as a trial. And that's testing products which actually aren't single-use for household products like detergent and food as well, I think. I think Haagen-Dazs is part of it. And I think companies are now trying different models to see what type of things the consumer actually does want. And I applaud that, because it brings a lot of awareness and education, and also a reality check, because quite honestly, I feel sometimes that we're very privileged and we have the space, the time, and the ability to think about these issues, whereas a lot of people, you know, have much more important things that they need to think about daily for their lives. And so that's really my vision. One day, no bad consumer choices. Choices, but no bad ones. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Lorraine. Mark, you feel probably provoked now that you want to respond to some of the questions on the
That's okay, I've been
wall.
biding my time. I can take up the rest of the time now. I saw many different questions coming up and down, and certain other questions are raised. I think I'll just start with one that Nina raised, and I saw also reflected in many other questions about the legal base of the microplastics restriction. Yes, we heard that CEFIC had made a legal analysis of the microplastic restriction. Unfortunately, the first time we heard it was when Chemical Watch actually contacted us to ask us what do we think about this legal opinion, and unfortunately we hadn't seen it before, but and it came right in the middle of our IT crash, so I think it was a bit difficult to try to get our response to Chemical Watch, but I hope we managed. And for this, of course, these questions have been raised right from the beginning of our work. We met with CEFIC and many other industries right when we started this work, and we had similar discussions then. They raised their concerns. We answered them to our ability and how we understood REACH. We have been discussing this with the Commission right the way through our development procedure, and we are confident that this restriction is justified under REACH. Of course, we haven't, again, as I said, we haven't seen this legal analysis, and perhaps, I see Sylvie here, perhaps you could confirm if not this was could now put into the public consultation for as this is meant to be. And this is a kind of a general comment that I'd like to make. It's very easy to make statements that we see here, don't block and push away, legal concerns must be taken seriously. Of course, we do take these very seriously, but the way to make these comments is in the public consultation, as I said, and these comments need to be fully justified. And I think it demonstrates why we are in an open EU society, that we can make these comments on legislation. This legislation is open to comments for 6 months. Everyone has a chance to make fully justified comments, and then these will be taken into account either by the committees or later on by the Commission, because the legal issues are not something that the committees will deal with. This is something later on for the Commission, but it's important that this is put transparently into the public consultation, and I hope that this legal analysis as well will be not made confidential. I think if it is so important, it should be made public, and so that everyone can see this and also have the opportunity to make comments on it. Thank you.
Thank you. 2 more questions before we will have to close. Let me start over here. I think you were the first one. Again, if you could introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. Dragan Jetic from Syngenta, and I'm afraid I'll go back to microplastics. So I'm just curious, I mean, developing a restriction proposal with such a wide range of uses was quite challenging. And I would like to link this to a topic from yesterday when we talked about measuring performance, and when we heard from the Commission how important the interface between different pieces of EU regulation is. And in general, we tend to look at pesticides and chemicals as 2 separate entities. I don't know, is there anyone else here from crop protection industry? But when it comes to microplastics and uses, we heard a lot how agriculture is the dominant when it comes to direct emissions and direct releases, that it's over 60%. And then we talked about encapsulated pesticides and seed coatings, but in fact these 2 are just a bit over 2% of the emission. But when it comes to the interface, we have the review of the open literature, but the way plant protection products are regulated means that these microplastics as parts of formulations are already extensively tested under plant protection products regulation, and no effects were observed because they would not be approved. So that is one thing. And then when it comes to transition, so if the restriction does get into force, we have the analysis of the time needed to redevelop a formulation, and this has been 5 years in the restriction proposal. But again, this doesn't take into account the huge difference that exists in a way you would register a substance under REACH and you would register a product under plant protection product regulation, which can take significant amounts of time, because one thing is to redevelop an alternative and the other is to put it on the market, and this can be a huge gap compared to other uses in the proposal. So yeah, I just wanted to ask how was this interface taking into account when it comes to the interaction between plant protection product regulation and REACH?
So Mark, while you think about the response to that question, I can maybe get our last questions before we will unfortunately have to finish. You had a question, right? Yeah?
Yeah, sorry, so just in response.
No, I want him to think a bit about the response. So, no. You want to respond? Okay. Do you want to? Okay, sorry. I got the wrong here. You want to respond to him?
So is it good now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, so Sylvie Lemoine from CEFIC, yes, on the legal opinion, because I think Mark was...
Okay, good.
The legal opinion is, well, first it's labeled client attorney confidential. It should never have been provided externally. It was not meant to be provided under the public consultation. It's meant to help us understand, the legality. Yeah, you saw on the wall, there are some questions. There are questions from members. It's really, it's only a supporting tool. So we'd be happy to discuss some elements of it with ECHA, with the Commission, sure. We have not submitted it as part of the public consultation comments. We sent some comments yesterday. It raises some serious concerns. So yes, we have some concerns with some elements of the restriction, and we'll be happy to further discuss that. But let me be clear, it's one element. There could have been a second, a third potentially. I mean, we tried to gather all kinds of information to assess the impact of the restriction. So I hope that clarifies. But we do regret that it went out to the press. It should not have.
Thank you. A bit more for the bilateral afterwards, I think so. But Mark, you want to respond to the last question on the regulations?
Yes, I mean, we spent quite a lot of time looking at the different interfaces with legislation, medical devices, medicines, pesticides, fertilizers, biocides. This was one of the areas that took up a lot of time, and we were in discussion as well with our colleagues in EFSA and also with our colleagues in the European Commission in DG Sante. So we have discussed this quite extensively with them, and it is our understanding at least that it does deal with the interfaces in an appropriate way. But what I would say is that if you think that perhaps the transitional times are not adequate for some reason that we didn't take into account, then we would very much encourage this information to be sent in a public consultation, because I think this is something very much that the committees can consider, and then they can advise the Commission in their opinions if they think that the dossier submitter, in this case ECHA, has got it wrong. And of course, it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes even we get, don't have all the information, and perhaps the transitional times could be extended.
Great, thank you so much. That brings us to 11 o'clock. That means the end of the panel. I would like to thank the panelists for being available, for your great presentations, for being ready to respond to some quite difficult questions, also to everyone here who has actively participated. And let's all agree, there is a problem. We need to address the issue of plastics, marine litter, marine plastic litter and microplastics, but also that we are all part of the solution for the future. Thank you very much. Please use the opportunity of the coffee break to ask more questions and engage with the panel members. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob, and the panelists. This was really a lively discussion, and where Jacob started with plastic is fantastic. I think that we still think about it like that, and we all do, but we need to do it in circular models and in a sustainable way. I would like now to invite you all for coffee, and I'd like you to be back in the room at 11:30. Thank you.